Okay, let's go over the key points from this lesson. The first one is that forecasting is a means, not an end by itself. It's part of a larger demand shaping, demand planning, demand management process, and it's not just being forecasting for forecasting's sake. It's being used for a purpose, whether it's to plan your inventory, plan your capacity, plan your operations. But it's part of a larger process, and it's important to remember that whenever you do any kind of forecasting. Then we talked about 3 truisms, and the interesting thing, these are always fun to talk about, but what's more interesting is what are the implications. So first we talked about that all forecasts are wrong. This is true, but what does this mean? Well, this means you should probably think about range forecasts, get at a range of possible values that you're estimating, and also look at the error terms. Capture your forecast errors, because that'll help you create a more robust forecast. The second truism is that aggregated forecasts are more accurate. And the idea here is that yes, you want to aggregate over SKUs, over time, or over locations wherever possible. And this is the idea of risk pooling, where if I pool different things together, I can share and minimize the overall risk and the overall coefficient of variation. And then the third one was that shorter horizon forecasts are more accurate than longer horizon. It's easier to predict tomorrow's temperature than a year from tomorrow. And this suggests the idea of postponement. I want to move that point of final customization as close to the final point of consumption as possible, because then I'm predicting my forecast is over a much shorter horizon. So all 3 of these truisms, while they're fun to talk about, have direct implications of how you want to manage your operations. Then we went into different approaches for forecasting. We talked about subjective and objective approaches. On the subjective side, we looked at judgmental approaches, and these are the idea where someone somewhere knows what the forecast is, what the actual demand is going to be, and our job is to try to extract that from as many people and find out what the real answer is. Then we talked about experimental, another subjective approach, and this is where you test on a small set of a small sample and you extrapolate to the larger market. Then we talked about 2 objective approaches, causal analysis, and this is where we think there's an underlying driving factor for demand that we can capture and measure ahead of time, and I use that as a proxy to forecast demand. Then we talked about time series, which is very different. It's a black box approach in that we look at past history and we look at patterns, and we try to find what patterns exist and use those patterns to predict the future. So all 4 of these approaches are used. They're all valid. In fact, most companies use a combination of these. You don't just use one type, you use a wide range that gives you more information. So while we'll talk about them individually, you should think about when you're developing for forecasting any kind of models, you want to look at all of these approaches because they're all valid in different situations. And finally, we wrapped up by talking about forecasting metrics. And the idea that we first talked about was the idea of accuracy and bias, and how those trade off. You need to capture both bias and accuracy. And then we talked about 3 metrics: the mean absolute deviation, the root mean square error, and the mean absolute percent error, and some other ones, but these are the 3 common ones. So we'll be using all of these different metrics when we talk about the different forecasting methods, and for the rest of the lectures going forward, we'll start using these different techniques and approaches. So if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please use the discussion.